Welcome to the October 2018 meeting of the Houston County Historical Society, special edition. I'm Deborah Stanfield, the president of the Historical Society. Many thanks to Jackie and Donald Bateman for their vision and the follow-through for this World War I project. Please note the exits to the front and the back of the room. Restrooms are on your right. We appreciate the generosity of the Tennessee Ridge City Hall for the use of this great building. If you would, please turn your phones to vibrate or turn them off or whatever you need to do. World War I. It was also known as the Great War, since there was no other world war to have any number associated with it. It was a short war in terms of months for the United States, entered on April 6, 1917, and ended on November 11, 1918. The war actually began in 1914, and the U.S. tried to stay neutral, but ties to Britain and the fact that our ships, were being sunk by German U-boats, among other things, led to the U.S. to become involved. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in history involving both military and civilian casualties. We have tried to capture some of the stories of our Houston County soldiers for you today, here on the side. Also note the memorabilia we have on display. The folders for the 12 soldiers who lost their lives during service. Not all were killed in action. The health situations they encountered were the cause of some soldiers' death. Please stand for the presentation of the colors by the Houston County Boy Scout 305 and remain standing for the national anthem as recorded by the United States Marine Corps Band and the pledge. Part the colors. Two.
Retire.
It is our pleasure to introduce retired United States Marine Gunnery Sergeant Charles Sweeney. Among his many accolades, Gunnery Sergeant Sweeney received 2 Purple Hearts. Sergeant Sweeney, we thank you for your service and would be honored if you would lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You may be seated.
Back on.
Am I turned on?
Yeah, I turned it off.
You turn me off?
I turned it off.
Oh, I'm back on? Okay. Okay, Charles.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm still a little young for World War I, but we're here to recognize the soldiers and Marines and sailors that fought in World War I. And as I mention their names, please stand and be recognized. Mr. Frank Cherry. Yes, sir. Thank you very much for your service. Mr. James Shimmy Copley. Thank you for your service. Mr. Fred Dotson. Thank you for your service. Mr. Russell Harris. Thank you for your service. And Mr. Webb Mitchell. Thank you for your service. That's all the names that we have here. There was there's one that didn't make it, Mr. Hugh Breeden. And there's one that's already passed, I understand a couple of years ago, Mr. James Earl Allsbrooks. We still want to thank them and their family. Thank you.
In this 100th anniversary year of the end of World War I, it is only fitting that we remember the service and sacrifice of the men and women of Houston County who were called to serve. First, we would like to recognize our Gold Star families that are in attendance today. Traditionally, a Gold Star family member is the parent, spouse, child, or sibling of a soldier who died during serving their country. Since it's been 100 years or more since these brave soldiers of World War I made their ultimate sacrifice, we are including in our Gold Star families any family member of a soldier who died in service during World War I. If you are related to one of the 12 Houston County soldiers who died while in service during World War I, please stand and remain standing so that we may recognize the service of your loved one. You are our Gold Star families. Family member called to serve during World War I, please stand and remain standing so that we may recognize the service of your loved one. If you are here today to honor the service and sacrifice of the brave men and women of Houston County who were called to serve during World War I, please stand and remain standing. Anyone else, please stand. We would like to ask Howard Spurgeon to present our invocation as we honor these brave men and women. Howard is a Navy veteran who served in Vietnam. His father served in World War I, and his granddaughter, Ashley Diane Short, is currently serving in the Air Force at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. His grandson, Cody Howard Spurgeon, is in the class of 2022 at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Mr. Spurgeon.
One minor correction to that. My father served in World War II, not World War I. So, let's all bow our heads to this. O Lord, of God of hosts, stretch forth your almighty hand to strengthen the men and women of our armed forces. Give them wisdom in all things that they might serve you without stumbling or stain. Keep their families safe and sound during days of separation. As we come together today in this place to honor those of the First World War, we also need to remember those who fought and were caught up in the tragic events of later wars. We pray that God will heal all memories and bring healing as we speak words of peace. Let us remember those who are fighting today as well as those who paid the price of the freedom we now enjoy. Today, the soldiers of World War I, we honor, and while memories of World War I haunt us today, we bow our heads and weep. Yet it's with respect we celebrate lives today of all those who fought for this courageous yet tragic event to help preserve our peace. Let us propose be to help our fellow citizens by remembering those who have served our nation. In times of conflict, let us be thankful for them as we thank the Lord for this day has given us to remember the legacy and strength of those members of our community who served during World War I. They fought not to destroy a nation, but a nest of evil ideas. The fields of Flanders and the trenches of the Flanders are now gone. They are nothing but a silent field providing flowers and memories for those that fought there. We also ask that the fields of Flanders and the trenches that are now silent, that everything became silent on 11/11/11. With that, in that particular date that we have, then the cold dark seas and the field of the poppies returned to peace. Gracious Heavenly Father, we pause to give our heads bowed before you to humbly ask your blessing and to give thanks to the goodness you have shown us. Assist us to overcome our human weaknesses and needs. You have urged us to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, and aid the poor and needy. Remember especially in your love those families who experience loss in wars, conflicts, those missing, broken in mind and body. We ask that you pray for us and provide us with blessings, Lord, on your effort to preserve our soldiers in battle. Amen.
You may be seated. So, Mr. Spurgeon, if you would take a second, we have a special request from your family. On this day, when we are honoring our past military heritage, we would like to give a salute to the future by presenting you with this portrait of the Spurgeon family commitment to the military, past and future. Looks like we're in good hands. Thank you to the Spurgeon family for your service, past, present, and future. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Glenn Baggett, Air Force veteran and post commander of the American Legion Post 73 in Houston County, who will present a brief overview of World War I. Glenn had a great uncle who served in World War I. Mr. Baggett.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. When I was asked to do an overview of World War I got to thinking there are so many aspects of the conflict of where to begin. So I thought I might do a brief discussion of the technology that was World War I and what these soldiers had to face. When we think of technology today, we think of self-driving cars or the computer that many of us have in our back pocket that just happens to make a phone call. 100 years ago, though, the technology concept was totally different. It was more about techniques and how to accomplish objectives. And I thought we could take a look at that for just a minute today. Initially, the European generals thought that the war, would be a battle of movement. Turns out it was a battle in the trenches. They had to figure out how to go from one side to the other and cross that no man's land without losing many lives. So the first technology advancement was the Army tank. Came out in 1915, British Mark I. Pretty soon, France developed their own version with the turret on top, which has given us the symbol we know today as the classic tank. Another significant advancement, unfortunately, were gas masks. This was due to the introduction of the poisonous gas in the battlefields. Gas masks were developed not only for humans, but they had to do it for the pack animals and the horses as well that were exposed to it. Germans first deployed chlorine gas on the battlefield in April of 1915 in France, attempting to exploit a loophole in international law that said gas projectiles were to be banned. They figured there was no prohibition against simply releasing the deadly gas and letting the wind carry it to the other side. Of course, there had to be advances in ammunition. Through the history of combat, very few successful battles were ever fought at night. The British developed the first tracer rounds. First efforts are not so successful, but in 1916, they deployed a version that trailed a green and white light and allowed them to see where they were going. These rounds not only eliminated that, but it turns out they ignited the hydrogen that the Germans were using in the Zeppelins, brought down many of them that way. Hand grenades and mortars also saw significant improvements, which also meant significant damage to the soldiers. We're going to skip this. Not all advances came on the battlefield. A new profession that's critical to today's world operation developed out of World War I. In the first days of flight, when a plane left the ground, the pilot was pretty much on their own. No way to provide input or receive any information. The U.S. Army began experimenting with installing two-way radios in aircraft prior to World War I involvement. And in 1916, technicians could send messages up to a distance of 140 miles. They could send messages to other planes, and thus the air traffic controller was born. The medical profession saw advances due to one of the most notable, also saw advances. One of the most notable was provided by Marie Curie. She set out to reduce the size of X-ray machines so they could be installed in small trucks and cars. She had 18 of these radiological cars, or little Curies as they were called, that toured the field toured battlefields. African-American inventor Frederick Jones developed an even smaller portable X-ray machine. On a side note, Mr. Jones also invented refrigerator units, air conditionings, and a self-starting gasoline lawnmower. With the increase in the power of the bombs came the injuries to the soldiers. And one of the most important increases in battlefield medicine was the Thomas splint. It's still being used on the battlefield today. In 1914, 80% of the soldiers with broken legs died because of it. By the time the splint was implemented in 1916, 80% of those soldiers survived. New techniques in facial surgeries and burns were also developed, huge advantage in prosthetic limbs and technology to meet the hundreds of thousands of amputees. This also ushered in the beginning of the ambulance corps. Before ambulances, soldiers were simply retrieved from the battlefield, loaded onto trains, and sent to the nearest town before they even started receiving medical care. Ambulances were able to start control the bleeding, clean the wounds, and begin those life-saving techniques hours or days ahead of time. One of the notables that came from this, the Volunteer Ambulance Corps, many people volunteered to serve as drivers. Authors E.E. Cummings and Ernest Hemingway were two. Businessmen Tony Hull, founder of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and Ray Kroc of the McDonald's Corporation also volunteered, even though the war ended before he got to serve. And now on a less technology-related note, the license plate that was on the car when the Archduke was shot read A111-118. Numerologists translate that to Armistice 11-11-18. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Baggett. After the war was declared, many young men volunteered for service. Several young men from Houston County volunteered at the recruiting station in Cumberland City and were sent to Camp Sevier near Greenville, South Carolina for training. Many of the first draftees from Houston County were also sent to Camp Sevier for training. All of these men would be assigned to various regiments in the 30th Division of the Army, better known as Old Hickory Division. Camp Sevier was one of over 30 new training camps built to train soldiers for the war effort. The 30th Division was the first to arrive and the first to train at Camp Sevier, which was carved out of a 1,900-acre pine forest in rural South Carolina. The first order of business for the new recruits was to clear the pine trees, remove the stumps, and fill the holes. Approximately 50,000 men from Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina arrived there for training in the fall of 1917. By November, a major outbreak of measles had occurred in Camp Sevier was under quarantine for 3 weeks. It was common practice back then for soldiers to write letters to their local newspapers back home, describing their experiences much like we might find on Facebook today. Although we do not have a letter from a Houston County soldier, We have a copy of a letter published in the Dixon Herald from a private S.A. Freeman, who was in the 105th Trench Mortar Battery of the 30th Army Division, which is the same division that many of our soldiers were in. His description of life at Camp Sevier is priceless. We have asked Mr. Bill Mayo to read Private Freeman's letter. Bill had 3 great uncles who served in World War I, and his father was a World War II veteran. Mr. Mayo.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be asked to read this letter. I find it very informative, and without any other ado, let me read the letter. Private Freeman had sent this letter to Dixon, to the Dixon Herald, and it was published on December the 14th, 1917. The headline for this letter was titled, "Camp Sevier Boys Are in Fine Spirits." And with that, he writes this letter. The quarantine, which has hung over the Camp John Sevier like a cloud, was lifted last Friday at noon amid the cheering of men in the camp. We again are permitted to go about the camp, to the YMCA, to Paris, and to Greenville, South Carolina. Saturday, every conveyance of any kind was pressed into service to carry the men to Greenville who wanted to go. The interurban trains were crowded to their utmost capacity. It looked like everybody in the camp wanted to go to Greenville at the same time. We're having some severe cold weather here at the present. We drafted men are suffering from a lack of winter clothing. The wind sure does whistle through our trousers, and we are hopeful that the weather will either warm up or we'll get our winter clothing issued to us. However, we're living on hopes that that will happen soon. We had another change in our bill of fare. Sweet taters and molasses have been taken off the menu, and black-eyed peas and macaroni was added. Private Freeman continues to write, if you have any friends in the Army, don't fail to write them, for it certainly does do a good soldier boy, makes him feel good to receive a letter from some of his friends back home. He writes, we are still progressing in our drill with Springfield rifles, and the next thing will be trench drill of 6-inch trench guns. Although we have not received the 6-inch guns yet, we're hopeful that they will arrive sometime in January. We now have some place to go in the evenings to write our letters and to see our friends, since the YMCA has been permitted to open its doors again. It certainly was gloomy here while the quarantine was on, as we could not even get out of our company street. We're just like a bunch of chickens, he says, cooped up and running wild. The Y is the only place like home that the soldier and our boys could make good use of. There have been some good moves made in camp recently. There was the putting of hot water in the showers. We had been having to either take a cold shower or not at all. And with the warm water, with the hot water in the shower, there's less danger of us getting a cold. The number of men to the tent has been diminished also. Before the quarantine, there were 9 men in each tent, but now there are 5, which makes it more healthy. In our tents, we use We use candles as our light, as the electric system has not been installed yet. The boys have to cut their own wood, every stick of wood they burn in their tents. Wednesdays and Saturdays are now wash days for us soldier boys, and that is for all of us except those that send their laundry away. But most of us can wash as good as any laundry. It sure is a sight to see us with our sleeves rolled up above our elbows and a scrub brush scrubbing out the dirt of our uniforms, our clothing, and other paraphernalia. Well, We have to keep our clothes clean, we're told, and as a result of ourselves. So they issued us overalls, that we might use them to keep our other clothes clean while we're doing tasks like cutting wood, grooming the horses, and etc. And we look like a bunch of rube farmers, he says, with those overalls on. And again, this letter was written by Private S.A. Freeman. He was part of the 105th Trench Mortar Battery of the 30th Division, Camp Sevier, Greenville, South Carolina, and he wrote this letter on the 11th day of December, 1917.
Thank you, Mr. Mayo. The family of Barry Boyd is the first Gold Star family we will highlight today. We have asked Brenda Lewis to tell us about the Barry Boyd family. Brenda's late husband, Mike, served in the United States Marines during the Vietnam War, and her dad was a World War II veteran. Here's the Barry Boyd family story presented by Ms. Brenda Lewis.
Barry Boyd enlisted at Cumberland City as an 18-year-old with his two older brothers, Jesse and William A. Boyd. They were all three assigned to the same company and sent to Camp Sevier, South Carolina, where Barry died of pneumonia during training, most likely as complications of the measles. Jesse and William were shipped overseas with Company L, 119th Infantry Regiment, 30th Army Division on May the 12th, 1918. Of the 234 enlisted men in their company, 16 men were from Houston County and 38 men were from surrounding counties. The 119th Regiment saw action in 4 major engagements, the most famous of which was at Bellecourt, where the 30th Division helped lead the charge which broke through the Hindenburg Line, which by all accounts helped shorten the war. William A. Boyd was wounded on October the 17th, 1918, but continued to serve after his recovery. He returned home with his brother Jesse and the other members of his company after the armistice was signed. Barry Boyd's brother-in-law, Andrew Jackson Winters, also served overseas during World War I.
Thank you, Brenda. Our second Gold Star family is the Bush family. We have asked Kay French, one of the Houston County historians, to tell us about the Bush family. Kay's grandfather served in World War I, and her dad was a World War II veteran. The Bush family story presented by Ms. Kay French.
Fred Bush was a 24-year-old telegraph operator for the L&N Railroad in Milan, Tennessee when he enlisted in the Navy. He was sent to Harvard College in Cambridge, Massachusetts to radio school to learn how to be a radio operator. He was assigned to the USS Lakemore, which was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat on its maiden voyage from Norfolk, Virginia to England. Fred Bush perished, but 17 crew members did survive. Reportedly, his last message was, "Tell Mother the ship is sinking and I'm going down at the post of duty." Fred's younger brother, Frank, was drafted less than 3 months after Fred's death. He was sent to Camp Gordon, Georgia. Tragically, Frank arrived at Camp Gordon in the midst of the influenza pandemic of 1918. Over 20 million people died worldwide. It was a particular problem in Army training camps due to the crowded conditions and the spread of disease with troop movements. Sadly, Frank died of pneumonia while aboard a ship bound for France. 2 other Houston County men in his company, William A. Mathis and Edward Lee Mathis, both died of pneumonia shortly after reaching their destination. Pneumonia was often a fatal complication of that particular virulent strain of influenza. More men died of influenza in World War I than were killed in battle. Frank's body was returned home to Tennessee for burial in the Bush family cemetery near Danville. The Stewart County Times published an article in 1928 about Frank's dog, Buck, who stood vigil every night after his master's grave was for 9 years until his death. The family had built a doghouse near the grave for Buck to protect him from the elements. Mrs. Betty McIntosh Nolan even wrote a poem immortalizing the fallen soldier's faithful companion called A Tribute to a Soldier and His Dog. Buck's story was included in the history of the Danville, Tennessee by the Houston County Historical Society.
Thank you, Ms. Kay. We have asked Rodney Lowe to tell us about our third Gold Star family, the Lewis family. Rodney is an Army veteran and his dad served in World War II.
Albert and Sarah Lewis, who lived near White Oak, had 12 sons. 7 of their sons served in World War I. It was thought at the time 7 brothers from one family might have been the largest number from one family to serve. Luther Lewis was the first son to join the Army, where he served in a machine gun battalion. Lonnie, William L., Horace, Charlie, and Dallas all volunteered at Cumberland City and were sent to Camp Sevier, South Carolina for training. They were all assigned to Company L, 119th Infantry Regiment, 30th Armored Division, and shipped overseas with the following men from Houston County: William A. Boyd, Jesse Boyd, James E. Tew, John T. Tew, Preston Cook, James L. Adams, Anderson Wynn, Elvis Stampler, Carl Bass O'Gwen, and Lester Durham. Lonnie and his brothers were excellent marksmen and quickly became known as the Tennessee Squirrel Shooting Bunch. The 119th Infantry Regiment was engaged in 4 major battles. Lonnie was killed in Belgium on September 1st, 1918, reportedly by sniper fire. Lonnie's younger brother, Walter, was inducted into the Army 5 days after Lonnie was killed. A little over 3 weeks later, he was on board a ship bound for France, where he served in a POW escort company. At the same time Walter was setting sail, his 4 older brothers in the 119th fought on with a heavy heart. They were engaged in one of the most significant battles of the war. Their battalion helped break through the highly fortified German defensive position known as the Hindenburg Line. Both Charlie and Dallas were wounded. 2 weeks later, William L. was also wounded. After recovering from their wounds, they rejoined their unit. All 4 Lewis brothers in the Company L 119th Infantry Regiment sailed for home on March 21st, 1919, with the remaining members of their company. After the war, they were all active in their local VFW, where they enjoyed being known for their marksmanship. Sounds a little like Alvin Yard, don't it?
Thank you, Mr. Lowe. Our 4th Gold Star family is the Warden family. We have asked John Thomas Warden's great-nephew, Keith Stanfield, to tell his story. Warden family presented by Keith Stanfield.
John Thomas Warden was my great uncle. He was the firstborn son of John Everett Warden and Sarah Harris Warden. Although I never knew him, I always knew how much it hurt the family to lose a son in such a tragic way. John Thomas Warden reported to the local draft board in Erin on August 17, 1918, just as the war was escalating, and the demand for more troops was high. George D. Outlaw Jr., Glenn Turner Griffin, Clyde Cathy, Nick Carl Meadow reported the same day, and they were all sent to Camp Gordon, Georgia. These men were needed to fill Houston County's draft quota. They replaced men who had been called earlier but rejected due to physical reasons. At Camp Gordon, John Warden and George D. Outlaw Jr. were assigned to the same company as George B. Hayes, Elmer H. Miller, and John H. Williams from Houston County. Their ship departed for France on September the 14th, 1918. They arrived in France September 21st, 1918. George D. Outlaw Jr. died of pneumonia a week and a half later on October the 1st. About a week later, John Thomas Warden died of measles and pneumonia on October the 8th, 1918, just 52 days after he reported to the draft board in Erin. Once again, the spread of communicable diseases such as measles and influenza had taken its deadly toll on these young soldiers. It's already been stated, and you'll hear it again, more men died of disease in World War I than died in battle. John Thomas Warden was initially buried in France, but was later returned home to be buried in the Parchment Cemetery at the request of his mother.
Thank you, Keith. On the home front, Houston County supported the war effort. The local Red Cross saw the benefit of several Red Cross fundraisers. We have invited Melissa Barker, Houston County Archivist, to tell us about Houston County's support of the war effort. Melissa's dad was a United States Air Force veteran.
When the United States officially entered the Great War on April 16, 1917, it had been raging in Europe since July 28, 1914, some 993 days. Bound by its government charter to support the U.S. military, the Red Cross was championed by President Woodrow Wilson as he called upon the American people to back the organization in its support of thousands of young men heading to the battlefields of Europe. Locally in Houston County and the surrounding area, the local Red Cross chapters answers the call for help, and they still do today. The local newspapers of the day are a great resource to us to know just what the Red Cross and local citizens were able to accomplish. I would like to read to you an article that was published in the Fayette Falcon, a newspaper from Summerville, Tennessee, which is in Fayette County next to Memphis, dated April the 19th, 1918. The article reads as follows, and I quote, "A broom which was first donated to the Red Cross chapter in Houston County by a widow who has 2 sons in the Army and had nothing else to give was sold in Dixon County, bringing $70. The proceeds to go to the Red Cross chapter. This broom was first sold in Houston County, bringing $61.50. It was then sent to E.L. Lewis of Humphreys County, who was the father of 12 sons, 6 of whom are in the service to Uncle Sam. It was sold in that county for $31.50. It was then sent to R.L. Few in Dixon County, who gave it to the Red Cross chapter with instructions to sell it as before, bringing $70. As of the date of this report, the broom has so far raised $163.50, unquote. In 1917, in another fundraiser, the Red Cross was having an auction. In this fundraiser, banker and prominent businessman Ewing Garner Harris, who was the mayor of Erin during World War I, had a quilt made and entered it into the auction to benefit the Red Cross. The Harris family had the quilt made with just the Red Crosses on the quilt with no names and entered it into the auction. Mr. Harris purchased the quilt back at the auction and then had all of the names handwritten onto the quilt by J. McDonald, who also signed the quilt. Most of the names on the quilt are World War I veterans. The only history that can be found on J. McDonald shows that a J. McDonald served as a records recorder for the city of Erin while Mr. V.R. Harris was mayor. Also written on the quilt is German-American War, April 1917. Obviously a term that referred to the war before it came to be known as World War I. This quilt was donated to the Herb Gould Veterans Park by Reverend Robert S. Mitchell in 2016. He acquired the quilt from Kathleen Norman, who was the daughter of Hunter Choate Harris. Mr. Harris and his brother, John Ewing Harris, were children of Kathleen Choate Harris and Ewing Garner Harris. Ewing Garner Harris was the son of Volney Rowe Harris, also known as V.R. Harris, and Lizzie Garner Harris. V.R. Harris was the first mayor of Erin and built a house in 1879 known as Casa Loma, which translates to house on the knoll or hill. Today this house is known as the Mitchum House. This house is on the National Historic Register as the V.R. Harris House. Mr. Ewan Garner Harris was also a mayor of Erin and a banker during the time of World War I. V.R. Harris is among those whose name is on the quilt. He served with the 117th Infantry overseas when the quilt was made. Through the efforts of Reverend Robert Mitchell, this beautiful quilt serves as a reminder to us all to continue to honor the service and sacrifices made during the war by those who came before us. In July of 2016, I was asked as the Houston County Archivist to be an advisor on the best way to preserve the quilt. That's when I discovered the name of Jeff Barker on the quilt. Jeff Barker is my husband's third great uncle. He was not one of my husband's ancestors that I was actively researching since he was only a third great uncle. While I am one of those genealogists that conducts research into everyone in my family tree and my husband's family tree, a third great uncle was not high on my priority to actively research. That was until I saw the World War I quilt. Jefferson Barker was born October 23, 1895 to George Washington Barker and Josephine Joanna Bernine. He lived most of his childhood and early teen years in Stuart and Tennessee Ridge. He registered for the draft on June 5, 1917 in Stewart County. On his draft registration card, it states that he was employed by James Lane making charcoal at Bear Springs. On October 3, 1917, Jeff Barker was inducted into the Army and served with Company F of the 117th Infantry. On May the 11th, 1918, he sailed from Brooklyn, New York on the ship Northumberland to fight in the war in Europe. According to military records, he was severely wounded in action on October 19, 1918. 5 months later, he sailed from St. Nazaire, France, on the ship Pocahontas, arriving in Charleston, South Carolina on March 28, 1919. Jeff Barker was honorably discharged on April 15, 1919, after 1 year, 6 months, and 12 days service to his country. Jeff lived the majority of the rest of his life in Michigan, although the family remembers him making visits to Tennessee Ridge to visit Lanny and Ruth Barker at Grace Crossing. He married later in life and never had any children of his own that I have been able to find. Jeff died November 15, 1981, at the age of 86 years. He is buried with a military tombstone in the Mount Evergreen Cemetery in Jackson County, Michigan. We are fortunate to have this priceless quilt hanging here in the Tennessee Ridge City Hall today. We hope you take the time to look at it before you leave and remember that these men who served our country with honor. Thank you.
And for those of you who haven't seen, the quilt is right around the corner here. If you can't read the names on it, there is a key on the side that tells what names are on the quilt itself. Every soldier has a story. We have some great stories here in Houston County. At this time, we would like to ask Mr. Scott Lyle to come forward and tell about his grandfather, Mr. Arthur O. Rye's story.
Thank you, Deborah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Lyle. I'm the paternal grandson of Arthur Otis Rye, a private in 150th Infantry, the 38th Division of the U.S. Army. Private Rye was born on September the 15th, 1892, and he died on June 26, 1951. He served in combat in France in 1917. Granddad Arthur wouldn't talk about his service, his combat service. All he would say was, I got close enough to hear the big guns. Well, a lot of them are like that, right? But I do believe Granddad Arthur believed in serving. He served in combat in World War I. He served as sheriff of Houston County between the wars, and in the Second World War, he worked as a guard, guarding the Danville Bridge against German and Japanese saboteurs. And they never saboteured it, so I guess he's done a pretty good job. There's just one, I say it's a story, but it's one thing I guess he couldn't cover up, amazingly. After his training, he was drafted, inducted, trained, and then sent across the Atlantic Ocean on a ship, naturally. There were no planes back, well, there were planes then, but anyway. But halfway across, he had appendicitis attack, amazingly. And he was operated on by the medics, not doctors, they were medics. I guess bite the bullet, but let them do it, and take his appendix out. You know what, Granddad ought to be going, why me, Lord? Come on, give me a break. have going off to war, you play this on me. But that basically about it. Monica, would you like to add anything?
Mr. Sales Robbins told me the story over.
Yeah, a local band, Thales Robbins, went, back in this day, this group stayed together from communities, and Thales Robbins went with Daddy and Granddaddy, and he said that after the operation, he offered to carry his bag.
He offered him his blanket.
Yeah, he offered his blanket.
He said, no, he was fine, he was gonna make it. And then he offered him to help him carry his bag
Yeah.
when he got off the ship.
Granddaddy said, that's fine, I got it, no problem. It's just an operation, so let's go fight the war, right? Anything else?
That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and we would like to let you know too that some of Scott's memorabilia is on display on my right or left over here. We would like to ask Mr. Bob Wren, a member of the George William Nolan family, to come forward and tell Mr. George William Nolan's story.
My grandfather was George William Nolan. I called him Daddy George, and I always wondered for a while why he had one leg. Well, he joined the Marine Corps in Memphis on February 11th, 1916. Went to World War I, fought in the Battle of Woods, and during an attack, he lost his leg to a mortar attack. A big fellow Marine saved him, picked him up, moved him behind him, said, you might get hurt, let me put you here. And I'd be dogged if he didn't get wounded. So they said it was terrible, all you could see was just smoke. They took him to the aid station, the big fella did, the Marine he said he's gonna save him. Took him, his backpack, and all of his equipment. They get there, and he survived the amputation. He could actually see the shrapnel hanging out of his leg. He comes home, never missed a lick, drove a tractor, drove a bulldozer, doing whatever he wanted to do. Daddy George was a mess. But what's so bad about it, later, while the family was waiting to hear what happened, they get a telegram basically telling them no chance of survival. And he fooled them. He survived not one amputation but two. Come home. The big Marine that moved him come to see him about every year, him and his wife. And he made a habit, him and that fellow Marine would go to all the Arrowhead divisions, what he called get-togethers, and sit down and talk about their days and what all they got into, what we don't want to know about probably. But I brought some stuff with me. I've got his hat, I've got his shrapnel, his medals, and some other stuff you all look at. Thank you.
The display case that Bob brought also has part of the fragment that was removed from his granddaddy's leg. We would like to ask at this time Miss Betty McKinnon to come forward and tell us the story of her father-in-law, Mr. Buren McKinnon. Betty's late husband, Bob McKinnon, was a World War II Army veteran and one of Houston County's biggest supporters of all Houston County veterans. Miss Betty McKinnon.
Thank you, Deborah. Gold Star families, God bless you. And thank you to all veterans. Thank you for your service. I've been asked to tell the story about one World War I soldier from Houston County that was told to me many years ago. Don't we wish our hindsights were don't we wish our foresights were half as good as our hindsights? Oh, the questions I could ask today, and how I would sit and listen more than what I did. But I listened enough to tell this. Virgil Buren McKinnon was born in Houston County in May of 1897. In 1918, when he was 21 years old, and the World War I was being fought, he enlisted in the Army. He was sent to Knoxville, Tennessee for training. From there, he was sent to Aberdeen Proving Grounds for assignment. And the hand of fate stepped in, and he was transferred then to Fort Dix, New Jersey. Fort Dix, New Jersey is just across the river from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In Philadelphia, there was a young school teacher who was a member of a sorority. When Fort Dix celebrated a holiday, they held dinners and dances. Women at that time were not in the military service, so the young school teacher and her friends would go to Fort Dix and, in her words, to dance with the soldiers. In February, they were celebrating George Washington's birthday with a dinner and dance, and the young school teacher and her friends attended the dance to dance with the soldiers. Fate again stepped in and placed the young school teacher, Eve Stalls, into the arms of a very tall and handsome young Southern gentleman by the name of Virgil Buren McKinnon. On the 15th day of March, 1919, he was promoted to the rank of corporal and assigned to the 666 Motor Transport Corps, but remained at Fort Dix. Every holiday from then on found them together, and then he began visiting in their family home. The Southern gentleman was discharged from the Army, but he returned to Houston County. This romance did not end, as they started corresponding, and a couple of years later, things got serious. In cleaning out some papers a few years ago, we found a letter Miss Eve had written. My dad had owned a barbershop in Philadelphia, and one of his regular customers was the manager of the Ford Motor Company plant, and she wrote, "If you will come to Philadelphia, I'm sure Dad can get you a job here." Being a country boy, he no longer desired to locate in the city. Bob used to say, "Thank you, Lord, for Dad's decision." In June of 1922, the young teacher and her sorority boarded a train in Philadelphia bound for Cincinnati, where she had to change trains going to Nashville. Seeing her safely on the train, her friends returned to Philadelphia, and she traveled to Nashville, where she was met at Union Station by the young Southern gentleman and his sister, Louise. From there, they went immediately to McKendree Methodist Church on Church Street in Nashville, where they were married. They then journeyed to Erin and moved into a house on West Main Street that today has the number 4385. They lived there until his death in 1976 and she in 1990. Imagine, if you will, a young lady, 25 years of age, coming from a city where she was used to paved streets, sidewalks, indoor plumbing, centralized heat, electricity 24 hours a day, and being able to go to New York City for voice lessons and attend her favorite, the Metropolitan Opera, and then moving to Erin, where we had open sewers, dirt streets, outhouses, coal stoves in one room for heat, a hand pump or cistern for water, and electricity that was on only a few hours a day, if that much. She must have loved him dearly and with her whole heart, because she stayed without regret until her death 68 years later. You have heard the stories of war and its casualties, so I would like to end this commemoration on a happier note. If it were not for World War I, would the young Southern gentleman had ever met the young school teacher from Philadelphia? I doubt it. So because of this, Houston County was given a young lady that taught second grade for over 38 years. That's somebody shaking their head. There are people today that tell me what a wonderful teacher she was, and how honored they were to have been in her class. She became involved in the county, and the Methodist Church had a great choir leader for 50 years. Many brides remember her singing at their weddings, and families remember her singing at their loved ones' funerals. At the age of 92, she was still going door to door to all the businesses and houses in Erin collecting for the American Cancer Society. She belonged to many civic organizations, and the family laughingly have said she probably belonged to both the Republican and the Democrat women because it gave her someplace to go. I, for one, am glad fate entered into Pappy's life, as he was affectionately called, because I was married for 69 years to their young son, Bobby, a World War II Navy veteran. Thank you for the privilege of letting me share this story with you.
Thank you, Miss Betty. As we close our program, we will honor the 12 men from Houston County who died while in service during World War I. After the reading of the poem In Flanders Field, which immortalized the fallen soldiers of World War I, each name will be read and the bell will toll. When all of our fallen soldiers have been recognized, taps will be played, which will conclude our program. We hope that you will stick around for refreshments, and please look at the information and artifacts we have collected. We have so much information on display that we did not have time to present. Please join us. Now we would like to ask Ms. Hannah Mehta to come forward and share the most famous poem of World War I, In Flanders Fields, written by John McCrae. Hannah's great-grandfather, Nick Mehta, served in World War I.
In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. In Flanders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scars heard among the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, and saw sunset glow. Loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields.
We're asking Mr. Herb Gould, a retired Navy veteran, to come forward and help us honor the 12 Houston County men who died during service during World War I.
I would ask you to please stand, if you're able, in honor of these Houston County soldiers who died in service during World War I. J.B. Barry Boyd, Albert Franklin Frank Bush, William Frederick Fred Bush, Alonzo McGregor Lonnie Lewis, Edward Lee Mathis, William Alfred Mathis, George Dedrick Outlaw Jr., John N. Reddick, Oscar Ross, Roger William Spears, John Thomas Warden, and Walter Howard Wyatt. This concludes our program.
Well,